Welcome!
You can do it by your own, or should I?
I'll try and then you can make it right. Is it? Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
A little bit down maybe?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. And then I just click this.
Yep.
And this is live
This is
stream
live
to Montreal. Okay. Mm-hmm. 30 seconds to go.
Hello. Good afternoon, Graz. Good morning, Montreal. Bonjour, Montréal. Welcome to the session on performance. I'm Olivier Lartillot from the University of Oslo, and I'm very pleased to introduce the first speaker, Michelle Phillips from Royal Northern College of Music.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Firstly, just to thank the conference organisers. This has been phenomenally well organised, really smooth, so congratulations, team. I hope you get a break after this. I'm going to present some data from a new project that I'm working on with my colleagues. We've just recently set up this PRISM Centre, the Centre for Practice and Research in Science and Music, and I'm going to present some of our first data from an app that we designed to capture live audience response, and I would really value your input. So the context of the study was that we wanted to look at perception of large-scale form. So this is something that there has been quite a bit of work on. There's quite a lot on local versus global processing. So what is more perceptually salient? The shorter musical details, the phrases, the melodies, the cadences, or the larger overall structure. A lot of the studies in this area are more in favor of local processing, so that salient features are more about the local detail. And there's some theories like Levinson's concatenationism theory, that music is perceived more on a moment-to-moment basis rather than as a whole. And that's a question I'm really interested in. There's a lot of work on what happens when you change segments of music around, and generally that work supports the notion that people generally that can go unnoticed, and also that it doesn't really change preference. So again, it supports the idea that overall perception of structure might not be as relevant in perception as local details. And that in tonal music at least, some of those local details that are important are things like cadences, changes in tempo. So what we really wanted to look at was contemporary music. One of the people on our team is a composer, Emily Howard, and we wanted to do something that looks at music, new music, and how it's perceived. So one of our main questions was, okay, how is non-tonal music perceived? There is some work on this, so generally tonal music is a little bit less known about how we process that, and there's been some really interesting papers in this conference on that. The research so far supports ideas that maybe tonal music might be more difficult to process, might be slightly more difficult to hold in memory, perhaps because it's not as familiar, at least to Western listeners, and that we might not be able to store it schematically on first hearing. However, there is some work that suggests that perception of segments and boundaries might be similar. The Clark and Krumm-Hansel experiment used some Stockhausen and found that boundary perception was similar to Mozart. But any research that's discussed what might be perceptually salient in tonal music is not, in atonal music, is not the same as tonal. And there's a really great study that's just been published, Broughton et al., 2017 that suggests that perhaps note density might be a factor by which people organize atonal music, so the amount of notes that occur over a specific duration. So we wanted to further this work, specifically with a live audience. There's also some research that tackles the question of perception of large-scale form dependent on training. So do musicians perceive large-scale form differently? Again, there's arguments on both sides, but the most convincing evidence, at least for me, is the work that Emmanuel Bigon's been involved in, which suggests that perception of large-scale form is more about general familiarity with Western listening than it is about musical training, and that anybody who lives in the world and listens to music is an experienced listener, and that perhaps that governs perception more than formal musical training. There's also some work that I've been looking at as well that suggests that familiarity with specific sorts of music is quite important, that familiarity can govern our perceptions in quite powerful ways. So these were the two effects in particular that I wanted to look at with the groups of audience members that we had. Okay, so our research questions, first of all, we wanted to test our design, our app that we designed. We wanted to look at what governs perception of segment boundaries in the piece that we chose, a piece by Ligeti, what musical features occur here, and is it influenced by training and by familiarity. So we chose Ligeti's Funfair. This is his Etude 4 from his studies. We chose this piece because it's considered quite an important part of contemporary music repertoire. These are challenging pieces of music to perform. This was performed at a live concert event where we launched our research hub. So we also wanted something that was, an important piece of music, a piece of music that we all thought made important contributions to the contemporary genre. But it also lacks some of those obvious things that tonal music has, which give rise to perception of segments. So obviously there's no cadences, but there's also no breaks. It's relentless. It's a piece that is made up both of an ostinato, so that's 7-quaver ostinato, and something that gets called the horn fifths in the other hand, so almost like a melody. And throughout the piece, this ostinato is relentless. It's 3.5 minutes, and the ostinato continues, and sometimes the hands swap, the registers swap. And quite nicely, in the score itself, Ligeti says it must be performed with no perception of bars. So again, it's a different texture to tonal music. So we worked with Richard Steinitz on this study, which was really nice for us because obviously he's one of the world experts on Ligeti's music. He came along to the event, and we worked with him to analyze the musical structure. So I won't go through this, but this is his summary, which he's published in his other work, of how the structure of this piece works. So it basically is alternations. It's basically one hand keeps the ostinato, the other hand plays this melody. And occasionally there's a break in the texture. So you can see on this slide, occasionally there's a slight break in the texture where one hand rests, but there's never a point where both hands rest. So one of our questions was, does that line up with any of our results about perception of boundaries? So we used Ligeti's Funfair. We had 244 audience members, so they were invited to download the app before they arrived. I think we had about 300 in the audience, so most people did download and use the app, which we were really grateful for. And they came along to this evening performance, which consisted of a premiere by Emily Howard, and then this performance. We asked them to tap when they felt a section had ended. So quite a loose instruction. We had a really wide demographic in our audience. We had teenagers, we had people who were experienced with contemporary music and weren't, so we simply said, tap when you feel a section has ended. And I'll show you some analysis, which I've used cluster analysis for. I've used k-means, but I'll discuss some of the advantages and disadvantages of that and welcome any feedback from cluster analysis specialists. So this was our app, the Prism Perception app, and it was very simple, free to download, and we were very fortunate to be supported by this grant and the team at the Oxford E-Research Centre to develop this app, which we'll use in future studies. So the first screen just gave participants some information. It gave them the ethical information about what we would do with the data. The second screen allowed them to input basic demographic details. So we asked them to fill that in before they arrive. Date of birth, musical training. The third option on the app was the tapping option. So they selected the performance, they received this screen, and they were asked, there's a box that pops up that allows you to synchronize, and then when the music starts, you can start adding your section ends. And they could delete a section as well if they felt they'd made a mistake. And then finally, the fourth screen on the app asks them to rate various things about the music, so subjective responses, familiarity, enjoyment, how they made their decisions about segment boundaries, which was really interesting. I'll show you that data. So we had this really nice performance, and we were fortunate to have student Maria Luke performing this piece expertly, because it's a really hard piece to perform. And this is what the data looked like. So it was, each row here is a participant, and then each of these is a timestamp. So these are in milliseconds. This is just a sample of the data just to show you what it looked like. So we had 244 rows like this. So to clean the data before I analyzed it, I basically removed all the start, all the synchronization taps, all the finish taps, and all the errors. And I haven't analyzed the error taps, but that in itself would be interesting. So we took this data. The really nice thing was that you could see straight away, when you just simply looked at all the taps in Excel, that there's agreement. It was really nice that we could see that there's clearly some agreement on where segments are in this piece. So this is all of the taps. This is just an extract. The piece was 3.5 minutes. This is just the first half, but it gives you an idea of the clusters. So I used a k-means cluster analysis. I also tried a hierarchical cluster analysis, but it didn't really suit this purpose with having so much data. And also, I could quite nicely define the number of clusters by analyzing this initial data. So I went for k-means, and what you get when you look at all of the data together, these are the clusters. So if you define a number of 48 clusters, and you do an analysis which asks which of those clusters were more common, this is what you get. So this is the start. So this is the start of the piece, and this is the end. So the most obvious thing that stands out there with all 244 audience members is that the most common place that they tapped was towards the end, and that's here. So that's quite interesting. The place that they tapped was when the texture, in many ways, broke down. So this was the first point in the piece where you had a note as long as this. And it was also a place where the dynamic was the maximum in the whole piece. So that gives some indication of two very salient features that people made their decisions based on. The overall texture of this piece, where the very pervasive pattern of ostinato and melody breaks down, that governed most people's judgments. But then there were other things that were, when you look at all of the taps, seem to stand out in terms of how people make decisions. One of the main things that swayed people was dynamic change. So this is a piece that has extreme dynamic range, as much contemporary music does, and whenever the dynamic changed very quickly, people often denoted that as being a segment boundary. It shows one other thing that governed people's judgments quite pervasively, which is a change in register. So if there were the melody suddenly came in one of the hands and it was extremely higher or lower than before, again, people tended to tap. So I'm not going to talk anymore about all of the taps. I'm just going to show you what you see if you look at musicians and what you see if you look at people who are familiar with contemporary music. So here's all that data, but I'm going to show you it individually. So it's quite nice if you map on a cluster, if you do a separate cluster analysis of those groups, and you can see there are some differences. So first of all, if you look at musicians, so the orange here is musicians and the blue is what you've just seen. This to me is really interesting because when you look at the cluster analysis, there's no significant difference between the taps by the musicians and the taps by everyone else. So it's quite interesting that musicians tended to perform about the same. We had about half musicians in the audience. So there wasn't much evidence there of difference. But when you take, so the question we asked people was, how familiar are you with contemporary music in general? And they rated it on a Likert scale. And it was quite obvious when you just look at the initial taps that, so here this is quite small, but the blue is people who are familiar with contemporary music and the orange is people who aren't. So they're the people who gave a 5 or a 6 or a 1 or a 2 on the Likert scale. And you can see straight away, before you even do the cluster analysis, that those who are unfamiliar were a bit more sporadic, and they tended to tap earlier, and those who are more familiar tended to cluster more. So when you look at this, when you do the cluster analysis, you can see this even more clearly. So if you look at the yellow, you can see that the people who were more familiar tended to save their judgments more towards the end. This is a smaller group of people. And the unfamiliar data behaved more like everybody else. And you can then see, so these are the cluster analyses that we've done. So just from that, it suggests that perhaps rating of familiarity of contemporary music is more powerful than formal training as a musician in decision of segment boundary in contemporary music, which I think is quite interesting. I find that interesting being from a conservatoire as well, because I think I work a lot with composers and performers of contemporary music and trained musicians. It's quite interesting to think that that training might not be as important as general familiarity with the genre in how you perceive sections. So then the final thing that I looked at was self-report of how people make these decisions. So one of the questions that we asked on the app afterwards is, how did you choose when you tapped? It's quite a difficult question for people to answer, and we did have quite a few people who said, I just guessed. So it was challenging for people, but I think that was quite important data to gather. The unfortunate thing with this that we'll have to think about for future experiments is that only 77 people filled in this final section, and you'd expect some drop-off because they went home from the concert and not everybody filled it in, but that's something that we'll have to address methodologically, because it would have been nice if all 244 had filled this in. So what you can see from this, I'll just explain this to you, thank you. So this is everybody, this is all the taps. These are the familiar and unfamiliar responses, and these are musicians and non-musicians. And I've only given you the top categories here. So I took everything that people had said influenced their decisions. It was a free text box. And I analysed that and I grouped it into categories. And these are the most common categories. And they're ordered in terms of the total responses. So they're ordered from most popular to least popular on total responses, which is quite nice because you can see how they differ from the others. So first of all, it's quite interesting that the most common way which people said they made their decisions was speed. That's really interesting, obviously, because this is a piece that's relentless. Ligeti was very strict in saying that this piece everything must be even, no sense of bar line. So there was no change in speed. So that's quite interesting that people perceived one, or at least thought that they perceived one and that it influenced decisions. Secondly, you can see that register and pitch and melody influence decisions, which backs up the cluster analysis, the dynamics and change in register influence decisions. But then the things that you can see that are different in the two groups are also interesting. So first of all, you can see that those who are familiar with contemporary music were slightly more likely to say that there were no sections and they would only press at the end, that this wasn't a piece that had sections. And you can also see that musicians were more likely to say that their decisions were based on sound or tone in general, rather than specify the other parameters that are perhaps more associated with tonal music. And then finally, musicians also were also a bit slightly more likely to say, we guessed, or we were confused, or it was difficult. But I think, again, this analysis backs up that idea that familiarity with contemporary music is perhaps more likely to lead to different decisions than musical training. Thank you. So, in summary, we had high levels of agreement on where section boundaries occur across all participants. And the most pervasive of those was the end of the piece, where the texture breaks down. Music training had little effect. These were all, the definition of musical training for the purposes of the study was 10 plus years of either form of musical training or playing an instrument or both. So they did have a significant level of musical training. And familiarity with contemporary music seemed to govern responses to a greater extent. Obviously, there was some overlap between those groups, but they weren't the same. It wasn't the case that all musicians were very familiar with contemporary music. And then finally, the self-report results are interesting because on the one hand, they support the analysis, but on the other, they give some indication of why and how these two different groups make different decisions. So, yeah, that's everything. And thank you to Richard Steinitz for his input and for Luke Jones, who helped with the analysis.
We have to wait a few seconds for the synchronization. We start to ask. So, is there any question? A lot of questions. So let's start from bottom.
Thank you for an exciting talk. I have kind of a few questions. So firstly, do you think that the speed, the reason why speed was one of the highest is because it was the perception of speed when there was one change where the hand kind of stopped moving and just the perception changed and the performer didn't change speed?
I think that's exactly it. So the performer definitely didn't change speed,
Okay.
but I think you're right. I think the perception of speed was down to a combination of all these other factors. So partly when the melody dropped out and just the ostinato continued, I think those two different sections of material in the music, they're very different. One's much more longer in duration, one's much faster. So whenever there were rests in one hand, I think that's giving people a perception of different speeds.
And then my next question are related to perhaps computing. So did you also use the piece and then perhaps using the MID toolbox or another computing to see and compare the ground truth to a computing way? And do you think that this data would have an implication for perhaps developing a tool to kind of segment contemporary music compared to classical music?
Yes. I haven't done that, but that's where I'd love to go next. Because I think this is an initial step on a series of experiments that we'd like to do, which will hopefully give better understanding of perception of contemporary music. I think we're fortunate to have a team of collaborators that can do that, and it's quite exciting to think. I mean, what I'd love to do next is to actually work on a new piece of music that had intended segments and to play with these predictions and then eventually to model it.
I have more questions, but we can talk later.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. A second person here in Grasse, and then we will see in Montreal, and then we go back here.
Okay. Thank you. Amazing presentation. I have one question. First is, you show the criteria, the speed, and I wonder if the second and the third, that is register and pitch and melody and contour, may in some way overlap also, because you divided the criteria, and the question is if in some way the contours, the criteria, and also the register could in some way belong to the same general criteria.
That's a really good question, and I did think quite carefully about whether they should be divided or together. I think I can't remember which study it was, one of the references, I can't remember who did the study, but there's a really nice study that shows that perception of melody is not just about the notes themselves, it's about contour and form and process. Yeah. And I think you're right, melody isn't just about the group of notes, it's about all of those other things, and I think they could go together. It would be nice to run a study like this again and to probe the audience a bit more to say, okay, exactly what do you mean by melody or by register or pitch?
Okay, thank you.
Let's switch to Montreal. Justin, and then you have a question?
Well, yes, I do. Hello, Michelle.
Hi, Justin.
Good to see you.
You too.
And this follows up from the previous question, but before that, what came to mind when you were presenting the stimuli is those highly salient moments where there's a lot of agreement, or where the auditory streams were reorganizing, which doesn't require musical background or those kinds of things. It's a low-level, very basic perceptual mechanism.
Yep.
So I'm wondering, in addition to thinking about a mere toolbox analysis, just look at it in terms of where the auditory streams reorganize, not necessarily break, but that's where I think you were getting a lot of segmentation, and then look at auditory features rather than musical features per se, especially for contemporary music, where I think that those features might be more salient. So that sounds
really interesting. I mean, that sounds really interesting. I agree. That would be a great way to do it. It would be nice to get maybe talk about that after, because that's not something I've done before, and maybe if you have tips on that, that would be really useful.
Talk to Al Bregman.
Talk to who, sorry?
Al Bregman.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. Can we? Okay. A second question from Montreal.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi.
It's Matt Woolhouse here.
Hi.
Hi. So I was going to, unfortunately, because of the just of the way the rooms are set up here, I missed the earlier part of your talk. So you may have covered this, but I was going to ask about rules derived from something like GTTM.
Yeah.
And the extent to which those are applicable within the contemporary music context.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this, I haven't related this data back to them, but it would be, you're right, it would be really interesting to do so, especially given this is something that, although it doesn't have the bar lines, it does have a sense of, has a strong sense of metricality and a strong sense of pattern. So it would be really interesting to see if you could identify stress points and you could maybe map that onto some of the theories in GTTM. I agree, it would be really interesting.
Okay, let's go back to Grace. I think there were other questions. Estra.
Yeah, thank you for this talk. And I think I'm also lingering around the same thing. These points where you had incredible overlap in terms of segmentation, and you were showing like fragments of the original piece. Yeah. If you look at those fragments, could it be that those points where everyone, regardless of their familiarity, overlap are the inter-onset interval thing, the durational stretches, rather than, let's say, a reoccurrence of a melody or a dynamic change? So see which feature really drives it. I think also the other colleague was mentioning it, and Justin on that. And another, so look at the, yes. And the other thing with respect to speed, I was actually thinking whether dynamics, like all of a sudden a forte, forte, fortissimo would create an illusion of speed.
Yes.
So that would be interesting, actually, if there's such an auditory illusion there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I don't know what's driving this assumption that speed is the governing factor. And I imagine it's a combination. But you're right, it'd be really interesting to look at. And with the inter-onset interval, that I've thought about that, and it's a really good point, because I think also I have a concern that people weren't necessarily tapping at the end of a section, but at the beginning of the next. And I do think that, so the cluster analysis that I've done allows a reasonably wide margin of error to capture high density data in the data. But I do wonder whether people were reacting to the next section. Oh, that must have been an end because here's a new thing. So it would be really interesting to look at that at the onset intervals.
A very quick question by Carlos.
Hi, very nice talk.
Thank you.
I was wondering, did you check if the tappings corresponded to, or to what degree corresponded with the ostinato? In particular, this etude, so the ostinato goes through all of the piece. And so then, kind of on that question, so why not try with the first etude, so which has so clearly two, where the bar lines are kind of moving for each bar? Or
That's a really good point. I think you could do this experiment with the whole with all three books of the etudes, because they're all really nice, aren't they, in terms of changing textures and quite clever devices. Yeah, the first etude would be interesting. I often think Vertige would be quite interesting because that's relentless in both hands. So you don't have the ostinato and the horn fifths.
So because in this particular case, well, the ostinato goes throughout all of the piece, and if I remember correctly, at least in the versions that I'm familiar with Aymard and Idil Biret, so both of them have very characteristic accentuation patterns. So then, at least, so when I'm thinking of it, so I'm thinking of the accentuation pattern.
Yes, and I think the accentuation is even more interesting given Ligoti's own declamation about how he wants it to feel.
So then I wonder, so if this accentuation pattern that would define, so that would be the performer who is kind of defining where the participants are going to segment the piece. Yeah,
I think you're right. I think the implications for the performer here could be really interesting. And I agree that the ostinato wasn't governing responses as much as the melody.
I'm terribly sorry, but we have unfortunately to finish this discussion. So let's thank the speaker again.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. It's looking really nicely, isn't it, the link? Was that Matthew? Woolhouse. Did you hear? Was that Matthew Woolhouse who was asking the question? I don't know. I think it might have been. He's a good friend. I think it was him.
So you can put it somewhere. Okay, yeah. No problem. So,
It's honest.
yep. So maybe.
Interesting. Good. Hello, hello. Oh, yeah.
This is yours, I think. Right?
Yes. So the time is there?
Yep. You will start in 40 seconds.
Okay.
Okay, I'm very pleased to introduce the next speaker, Shen Li from the University of Sheffield.
Thank you. And thanks for everyone coming here and listen to my presentation. It's my great honor to be here and to introduce my part of my PhD project. And so this is mainly about the communication of piano timbre between pianist to his listeners and how it is dependent on the audio-visual listening mood. So to begin with, piano timbre is quite a tricky project because it is a long debated topic in terms of whether pianists have the individual control of their sound. Well, this has been debated for 100 years, yeah. And but we got some recent acoustic evidence proved by Werner Gelbo, and some types of touching can influence the produced sound, and like percussive or non-percussive touching, soft and hard touching. But the listening experiment shows that actually the sound, if it plays back to the listener, it is very hard to detach the difference. But the acoustic is a camp. We now look at how musicians sing. For musicians, for pianists, for the educators, they think piano timbre absolutely can be changed in terms of different touching intentions, and they have claimed the teaching and learning of piano timbre has great importance in piano pedagogy. And also, by recent linguistic studies, they also found how the people describe piano timbre in hundreds of terms, like bright, dark, dry, velvety, this kind of. This reveals how we conceptualize the piano sound, how we conceptualize the timbres. So the question comes, if the sound word, if the colorful word of piano timbre exists for pianist, then how it can be communicated to his audience. And here I will show you examples. The first is a sound example, is a selected piece from Chopin's Winter Wind, and the same part but a different pianist. And the second one. Now I would like to show you the videos of the recording and tell me what you think. And this is another one. So let's do a vote. How many of you think the visual feedback influenced your judgment of the timbre? Oh, yeah, we've got many of you. So it's a visual information, actually, it did something on our perception of the sound. Sometimes when I say soft touch and the other one is very tense touch, this is, I didn't hear in the sound recording, but in the video recording, it gives me extra information. So let's look at how scholars do to investigate visual communication in musical performance. Their main approach is actually two approaches. The first one is to change the audio-video presentation mood and see how it influences on our evaluation. And another one is doing concurrent or inconcurrent setting. For example, saying A but hearing B. And their main findings is visual feedback influence many things in terms of the musical expressiveness and how we evaluate and appreciate music, and also our emotional response to the music, and also the perception of very small musical features like dissonance, tone interval, and the duration of tone. So, but there's not so many things I have done in the perception of piano timbre. But I did an interview study last year, and some findings inspired me of doing this listening experiment. Because in my interview study, it shows pianists, they do have intensive timbre intentions in their playing. They want to communicate to his listeners. And also, there is a strong association between their cooperating experience and the intended expected sound effect. So, put into another word, their feelings of tension, release, and weight, and also the directions of the touching, such as pushing, slide, falling through, makes them to think they have changed the sound, they have changed the piano timbre. So this indicated the relevance of studying visual cues in the communication of piano timbre. My hypothesis one is listeners' perception of piano timbre would be changed if we change different presentation settings, and we would find a difference between audio conditions and video conditions. And another hypothesis is based on piano timbre is not only an auditory product, it's not only sound. It is shaped by multi-dimensional sensory feelings like visual, kinesthetic, motor, tactile, and many things. And also it is embodied experience because of the action perception coupling, and because according to that theory, due to musician training, there has been a strong association has established between how we approach that sound, the action, and how the sounds like, the sound outcome. So we are reasonable to raise my second hypothesis is the communication of piano timbre should be successful and reliable between one pianist to another pianist. So here, the listener is also pianist trained. So, but with slightly difference depending on who is performing. So my method is doing a listening experiment. The sound recordings was recorded, and the musician score was borrowed from previous study by Michelle Bernet and Carolyn Trapp's study, because they have found this, they have used this score, and I found it's good to use because there is no specific music genre on it, and no specific mood, and quite a range of pitch. So it's super good to use. And the pianists were invited to my listening study. They were asked to play the same piece, but using 10 different timbres. It might be difficult, so I gave them 1 month to practice and gave them twice time to record. And finally, they were play with bright, dark, round, sharp, heavy, heavy and light. Sorry, I had something wrong here. Heavy, light, relaxed, tense, and velvety and dry. And you can see in the bright, dark, round, velvety, dry, the fonts in black. It's I borrowed also from previous study because it has proved it's the most 5 representative terms to describe piano timbre. So I just borrow and add another 5 to make it into five pairs. So the method is record like in this kind of studio with 2 cameras. One is facing to their body, the whole movement, and another is facing to their finger movements, and with audio recordings. And here is a sound example of the round timbre. And I have its opposite, is sharp. And 21 pianists were invited to my listening experiment with 19 females and 2 males. It's a shame to say there's less male students in the music department, so the gender is not balanced, but I don't think it influenced my results. So the procedure is all the stimuli was presented in 3 conditions: audio only, video only, and audio and visual. I have 3 pieces in 3 conditions, and also with 10 instructed timbres. So in total, I got 90 musician pieces, and the experiment lasts around 1 hour. And here is the response sheet I asked the listeners to rate. So they would hear a sound sample and rate on these 10 scales, all the 10 scales. So it's not a forced choice. They would ask to rate all the 10 terms, and from very disagree to very agree. The experiment variables was, and dependent variable is to look at how they evaluate the perceived sound on from 1 to 9 Likert scale. And the independent variable is to look at who is performing, the factor performer, and how it is performed. So the mood of audio-visual presentation, and also what's the actual sound, the instructed timbre. So the result I concern with 2 aspects. One is the percentage of correction, and another one is to look at the influence of different factors on the results. To do the percentage of correction, I have to recode all the data. So if we look at the picture, we would say the sound, instructed sound is heavy, and also the ratings of heavy is the highest. So 9 is the highest among all the ratings. So in this case, I would say the response was correct. So I would record as 1. Otherwise, it would be 0. And then I calculated the mean of all the evaluations, and that's the percentage of correct. And finally, I got the table. So With 10 different timbres, we can say from top to the below, the highest ratings were light, relax, and sharp, and the lowest one is darkness. So it means not all the 10 timbres was equally easy to communicate it. Some of them are very easy, like sharp, relax, light, but darkness is the most difficult one to communicate. But to compare with Chen's level of 10%, all the timbres were reliable communicated because it's higher than 10%. But if we look at the table in details, say AO, AV, VO conditions, these values are quite similar. So this kind of analysis won't tell the influence of AV listening condition. So if we want to look at that, we have to do another test, which is repeated measure ANOVA. So repeated measure ANOVA to test the evaluation of perceived timbre influenced by different factors. In terms of influence by instructed timbre, I only examined 2 levels to test how pianists differential a timbre within a pair, like how brightness was communicated compared with darkness. I won't compare with all the 10 levels. It makes my results complicated. And with AV conditions, 3 levels, with performer, 3 levels. So now let's look at the results part. And the results part tells us with all the main factors and the interacted factors, that's a lot. But if we look at the details, the main effect of instructed timbre, it tells us how successful the target timbre was communicated within a pair. Yes, thank you. But we would found for darkness, it is really hard. It is without any significant p-values. So darkness was failed to communicate compared to brightness. And the two-way interaction between instruction and performer tells us how our target timbre was communicated well depending on who is performing. And we found quite a lot. Here. With lightness, roundness, sharpness, relaxation, drowniness, and then velvety. And we found that different pianists have different abilities to communicate. And if we look at the instruction interact with AV condition, it tells us how well the target timbre was communicated depending how it is presented, sounds only or very only. And we found that relaxation and tension was better to be communicated in visions. If we look at this graph, the interval was larger in the VO condition. So without hearing it, just to say it, the perception of relaxation and tension becomes stronger. And the velvetiness is better in sounds in the other way. But in most cases, it's not two-way interaction. It is three-way interaction. So it means how well a certain timbre was communicated depending on who is performing and in which condition. And for darkness, we can say pianist 3 was better in vision only. And sharpness, pianist 1 is better in vision only, but pianist 3 is better in AO and AV than in sound. And heaviness was better for pianist 1 in sounds, AO and AV, and it is better for pianist 3 in visions. So to summarize, that's a lot of data, I know. I don't want to get you overwhelming about that. So to summarize, we found a significant main effect of instruction found for non-timbres, except for darkness. That means pianists, they are able to differentiate their performance within a pair, but for darkness, they failed to differentiate darkness with brightness. And we also found many interaction effects between piece and instruction. So it means different pieces and different performers, they deferred their ability to communicate to different timbres. Pianist 3 is better in light round, 1 is better in dry and velvety, and pianist 2 is worse in sharp and relax. So this suggests piano timbre is both performer specific and also the piece specific. So with listening condition, we found for brightness, no matter who is performing and no matter in which condition, brightness can be communicated successful. So that's the most special case. But we also found a few two-way interaction for relaxation, tension, velvety. So it means certain the audio-visual feedback influence the perception of that. But in most cases, it's three-way condition. It means we can't say which way is better, but it depends on who is using that way. So which performer is better using his own way to communicate certain sounds. And so to conclude, several but not all the timbre can be communicated in the audio-only mood, and visual communication improved the communication process. And maybe the piece itself carries certain timbre qualities, but this study suggested that pianists should learn how to communicate both using his body language and also the sound. So to limitation a lot, because I'm only compare within a pair, bright and dark. I didn't compare between bright and round, so that's a kind of limitation. And another limitation, I didn't compare the results with non-pianist listeners. So, and also pianists in this study are students, they are not professional performers, but thanks for their participation. And the pianist is not the finest instrument in the world, but that's the best one in our department, but it's also a class via, so I got my MIDI data, so I can analyze in my future study. So the next step is to do a recognition study, and also do the acoustic examination, and also how it is learned and taught in a lesson. So, yeah. To finish, there's one more example, but time is up. So thanks for your listening, and welcome for any questions. Thank you.
Wait a little, synchronization with Montreal. Okay. Any question? Yes.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. Maybe you explained that and I missed it. Could you tell me to what extent and how did you account for variation in other parameters, musical parameters? Because you are looking at timbre, and the two very nice examples that you gave us, where it was clear that the pianist changed several things: loudness, tempo, agogic. So how did you account for that?
Yes, it's a very great question, because to answer your question, I have to answer from more broad level, because in terms of piano timbre, the definition is slightly different with, we say, timbre of clarinet and flute, because of the timbre for pianists. Actually, it is a blended concept. Pianists, they know they changing the pitch, they changing the loudness, they changing the articulation, legato, staccato, but they prefer that they change the sound, they change the timbre. So timbre is piano timbre is a more combination of all the different factors. So my study didn't look at that. The interactions between different parameters, but it's a great question. I will do acoustic analysis further, so say how, in fact, how pianists changed in the different parameters. Thank you.
Okay, may I just to confirm. So do I understand correctly? This is of course very important, that your understanding of piano timbre, it's something like saying interpretation, so how they perform. So you account for everything that might be variated while playing. Okay.
Yeah, so it's mostly impression of the performed sound. Yeah.
Is there any question from Montreal? Yes.
Hi. Hi, Montreal.
Hi, good morning from here. Thanks for the talk. Could you speak a little bit more about the velvety timbre? I'm a pianist, and that's not something I think I know what it means, but I'm not entirely sure. And maybe what implications that has for both the subjects in your study and also in the participants who created the sound and audiovisual examples in the study. Thanks.
Can I ask you to repeat the first sentence of? I just lost it. Sorry.
I was just asking about asking for clarity about the velvety category in particular.
Yeah, velvety. Okay. Let me back to the slide. It's velvety is a kind of soft and very textural feelings of the sound. Actually, it is not. It is also borrowed from Bernays and Trapp's study, and it has been defined as one of the 5 most representative descriptors of the semantic space of piano timbre. And if you have interest, you can look at that paper in details. Did I answer your question? No.
And what were the implications? Was that? Do you think that was a terminology that was understood by the subjects and also by the performers?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Thanks for your question. And in my last interview study, I have given them these 10 timbres and asked them, would you able to produce different sounds on same music, but using different this kind of 10 timbres, and they show they have no difficulty to understand that. And even though my experiment was conducted in China and it's translated into Chinese version, and they shows no difficulty to understand that. So it seems this metaphors is universal used. So, yeah, thank you.
Any other questions?
Many thanks for this presentation. I wonder, you told us that the best recognized timbres are light, relaxed, sharp, and the worst dark, round, and bright. Could it be that the best recognized are those who are connected more to bodily movements or states, rather than timbre, which is more performance expression concept?
Yes, it's very great question. I'm also thinking of what influence their different levels of percentage of correct. So I'm thinking of these 10 timbres. If we think about that, bright and dark seems to be more emotional aspect, and why it is more bright is more easily to communicate is because in the video shows the pianists, they are showing their happy face in their facial expression. So even though without sounds, it can still be recognized. But for you mean the lightness and heavy is more movement associated. Yeah, and so without the visual feedback, if you only look at the sound, maybe so the listener would lose the information. So that's why I choose these 5 pairs, because bright dark is more emotional, heavy light is more movement, and sharp and round is more. I think it's hand shape related. So harsh sound or a more rounder sound, and also velvety and dry is more texture feelings of that. So I'm trying to give different categories, but in fact they are all overlapped. Yeah.
Okay, let's thank the speaker again.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig. Can you put it it on your belt somewhere? Or do you have a pocket?
No. Also lieber hinten oder vorne? Oder?
Also ist egal irgendwo, es haltet halt. Und das so hinter die Ohren klemmen. Genau.
So?
Vielleicht das noch.
Okay. Danke. Wo? Mhm.
Okay, it's my great pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Nicole Sandmeier from Lucerne University of Applied Science and Arts.
Thank you. Good afternoon and bonjour à Montréal. I would like you to recall the last concert you attended and imagine you would have to evaluate it. What would be your criteria? Music performances are evaluated every day in different contexts, from a chat after a concert to the ranking of a jury in a competition. One context where performance evaluation plays a central role is music education. It helps students to find their strengths and weaknesses and helps them evolve. Because it's such an important pedagogical tool, there has been a wide range of science projects conducted on this study, and still we don't have a clear understanding yet on the, However, we still lack a clear understanding of the mechanisms and the criteria behind a spontaneous expert evaluation in music education. So we took a look into the reality of our music department at the Lucerne University of Applied Sciences and Arts, and we interviewed teachers on the nature, purpose, and impact of the performance assessment. In doing so, we focused on the final performance exams of bachelor and master's degree. We ran semi-structured interviews with 10 music teachers, 3 female, 7 male, and we aimed at a variety of instruments taught and at a rich teaching experience. They had 29 years of experience and 18 of which at a higher education institution. The interviews were conducted in German between June 15 and June 16, and their mean length was 1 hour and 40 minutes. The questions focused on how did they experience the evaluation process and how did they come to a final judgment. The interviews were audio recorded and transcribed verbatim. Elena Alessandri, who is also here, and I each analyzed the transcription thematically by using line-by-line open coding. We individually compared and contrasted quotes to develop a map of emergent themes. We then met to discuss the themes and develop a joint codebook. To minimize subjectivity of interpretation, Each of us in turn explained the theme, justifying it with quotes from the interviews and proposing a definition. And the resulting codebook consists of 71 themes and sub-themes grouped into 5 families. This is the visualization of the codebook. Don't worry, I will zoom into each family so that you can familiarize yourself with it. So you have on the top a more abstract level of reflection on the nature of the evaluation process, followed by the principles applied, the criteria here at the core, and practical tools applied through the whole process by the teachers. Meta-reflection, we define it by observations on the nature, meaning, and scope of the exam. Evaluation of exams offer a chance for peer discussions, so peers they can exchange on methods and learning content. Basic criteria, there are a few, or it is agreed on that there are a few basic criteria shared independently by instruments or genre. And there is a high sense of responsibility towards the career of the students and towards the progress. And here I quote, "It is our responsibility to help students progress towards their learning goals." There is also a large sense of responsibility toward the standards that they set with assessing an exam. It is for their reputation as a teacher and also for the reputation as a school. And the Lucerne School of Music has a reputation for being demanding and giving very few A's in the classical institute. There's also a lack of standard, which refers to the discussion in the jury. I quote, "I've experienced different procedures depending on the head of the jury." And we move to challenges. We have 4 groups. First I read to you the definition. Aspects and circumstances within the evaluation process perceived as testing or difficult to deal with. And we have, I start with subjectivity. I quote, "As a head of the jury, I say, this is how this jury has decided. It is absolutely conceivable that a different jury will set different priorities. We are in an artistic field. To deny that would be irresponsible." Then I move, I'll start here and I move clockwise around the model. So we have the circumstances, for example, the snapshot. And the snapshot is the evaluation of a performance at a given time. It's just the time slot that counts. So the development of the student is not taken into consideration or any background information on the student. And further, it's the time constraints of the exams and the grades. We use the ECTS grading scale in Lucerne. And the complexity is mentioned of the process, and the next is the tightrope. We defined as the relative weight of the criteria used. So I quote, "I cannot tell this counts 10% and this counts 20%. It always depends on the balance of positive and negative aspects." We then have the personal biases, a lot of them. I will not read through them. Maybe an example for a conflict of interests. Our teachers are paid by students, so if they have a bachelor student and it's questionable whether he or not should go into a master's degree, it could be a conflict of interests for the teacher. Then we have the principles applied. I start here with flexibility. Flexibility, it's according to the weight of different criteria. So it means that you have a flexibility for adapting the weight of different criteria you use. Coherence is the comparability to different assessments, an openness to different stylistic and aesthetic solution, and a respect for the effort of the student. Here I quote, "The most important thing is to simply be respectful towards the student." And benevolence, being sympathetic, and being motivating. Here I quote, "The evaluation should always be constructive. It should always motivate the students to develop further." Justify means offering a comprehensible evaluation and the feedback, and authority means then an evaluation should be as well informed as possible. Then we have the criteria, the core of the model. We defined criteria as positive or value-adding quality standards by which the performance is assessed. And we grouped them into four: performance, context, musician, and listener. I'll start with the performance here. The technique of the student, then the notation is the accuracy to the score, communication with the audience, but also among the musicians if it's chamber music. Then the repertoire, our students get to choose their own program for the exam, and their stylistic choices. Then we have the context. We have the career perspectives. Here I quote, "The assessment of a final exam depends first and foremost on the success chances I see in the music market." And it's also a question of whether it's a bachelor student or a master's student, if it's a pedagogy master student or a solo performance master student. And this has led to quite vivid discussions at our research department whether or not this should be taken into consideration, because it is, after all, a performance evaluation. It's not a mocking lesson. It's to evaluate the student as a performer, as a musician. And it's also, here in this category, you also have the question whether the development of the student should be taken into account or not. We have some guidelines at the Classical Institute saying that the main teacher can incorporate the development of the student, but he or she doesn't have to do it. Then we have the criteria for the musician, whether about the risk-taking, the understanding of the music, the historical background, aesthetical understanding, stylistic understanding, the potential of the musician, the endeavor, whether he or she is listening to herself while performing, the immersion, and the reaction to mistakes or blackouts or to unexpected noises like the lawnmower or construction works in the building. The dependability, it's the trustworthiness that a student can deliver. There is also mention of mental stability here, and appearance, which is the stage presence. Then what does the performance do with the listener? Is he confident, or she, that there will be a positive outcome for the exam, of the exam? Is there thrill and excitement? And there is also mention of concentration, whether or not it's easy to concentrate during an exam. Here I quote, "I can tell by my level of concentration after 6 or 8 hours of exams. The best sign is when I'm suddenly totally present again." So we have the final family of themes, which is tools defined by devices and strategies that teachers employ throughout the entire process of evaluation. So we have, I start here. We have the guidelines. Like I said, we do have guidelines, but they do not include criteria for the exam. Then the listening, teachers taking notes, using the score. The dialogue refers to the dialogue within the jury. And they start the discussion with writing a numerical grade. That's the system we used to have before the ETCS scale. And they write it on a piece of paper and hand it in anonymously, and then the grades are discussed. And if they are too far apart from each other, then they loop. They go into the next level of discussion. And there is a mention of diversity within the jury. Here I quote, "The members of the jury balance each other out." And then the tool, of course, is the feedback. Our students always get the feedback at the end of the exam together with the grade. And I quote, "I personally appreciate the feedback culture at our school. Throughout all different exams, we give students a verbal feedback." And, "It is indeed a difficult task for probably anyone. We music teachers are not trained to extract the essence of a whole discussion into a concrete feedback." So here's the whole model again. And to sum up, we interviewed 10 music teachers at the university, at the Lutheran School of Music, to gain an understanding of how they experienced the performance evaluation process. The findings offer insight into their criteria, but also into the principles and challenges behind the evaluation. And our takeaway points are, we have gained an overview of the evaluation process from a psychological point of view of the evaluators, and how the criteria applied are embedded in a complex set of thoughts and consideration, including biases, conflicts of interests, etc. Finding suggests that teachers are well aware of the complexity of the evaluation process, and they show a great sense of responsibility towards the students. The findings offer grounds for further study in different assessment contexts, for instance, or other cultures or music genres, or in other languages. Our aim is to promote discussion and awareness in our department, and consider drafting guidelines for exams or ideas for continuing education. Because one of the feedback was, one of the response was that it is difficult to give adequate feedback for the students. Then I have some of the references. They are also mentioned in the abstracts. And then I thank you for your time and attention.
Questions from Graz? Yes?
Hello, thank you. I just made a note about the idea that you were listing out the points that the adjudicator, the jury, is looking at the exam for the students. And when I was doing my research, the participants were complaining in conservatoires to me that they are not told what actually they expect from them. So the question is that even so the jury knows what they are looking for, what to judge. Mm-hmm. Are the students prepared? Mm-hmm. The teachers, do the teachers prepare them what to be prepared for?
Mm-hmm. Well, some of them mentioned that they have guidelines, and one of the music teachers said that if we have to give guidelines to the students before a final exam, then we failed as teachers, because we should have taught them during their studies what we are looking at. So if we have to tell them before an exam, it's too late.
Yeah, I get it now. But the teachers have to be educated who teach the course, and to be linked with the jury members, you know, and at least at the beginning of the year, to teach them that, okay, this is we are expecting, and teach this to the students. And it was a very major problem from my participants.
So there was no match between the learning
Sometimes
goals and the criteria.
Some students were okay, but when there was a problem. One of the complaints about the teachers were that the manners how they were teaching, yes, critical feedback and not constructive feedback also. So I think it's really important to educate the instructors, even though they are really performing artists and sometimes just going in to teach, but they have to be aware, based on the feedback I got from the students, they have to be really aware how to teach, and also to know what the exam requirements are, because they need to tell them to be prepared. It's like, just to give a quick example, that one of the participants said that I lost marks because I didn't consider the room of the size of the room. So she was like, what? Thank you.
We have plenty of time. No worry, we will just switch to Montreal. Is there any question from Montreal? No questions?
No,
Okay,
there are no questions from Montreal.
Sorry? Yeah, okay, no question. Yes. Okay, so please.
Thank you. You just said that teachers, for me, it sounded like a bad excuse, but they say that because we should have taught them how to do it before, we won't give them the exact evaluation points before the exam. And I think it's not only about musical education, but I think this approach is wrong, because everybody who ever had an exam knows that it's a very stressful situation. And to not know exactly what is evaluated on that time, because obviously musical skill is abstract. We cannot learn during 1 year or 3 or 5 all that will be then our musical skill. So on every exam there's just one part, one perspective or one angle, even if it has a few points. So I just want to make a point that in general in education, I think the big part of stress that we have in something that's so natural to us, which is education, comes from the fact that there are bad excuses used not to precise what exactly is wanted from us on an exam.
Well, I'm sure the teacher wouldn't have refused to tell the student. It was just a question in the interview, well, should the students have the guidelines? And that was the response, that they should have, they should be taught before. It should be clear, but one of the teachers mentioned the use of guidelines, yes, of criteria, of a catalog of criteria.
They should have given it, if they don't want to do it last minute, they can do it at the beginning of the year. Just make it clear that musical skill is much more than that, and we're going to learn a lot of other things too, hopefully, but on this exam, that's what we expect from you. That's how you're going to be judged. Because else it's very vague to say we're going to generally judge you, so it creates a lot of stress when you really don't know what kind of angle you looked at, what you have to watch out for. It creates unnecessary stress. Thank you.
Okay, here.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Very interesting. I think it's a great thing to research as well. Sorry if I missed this, but I was wondering if your interviewees were external to the institution or only from that institution, and if
all 10 were from the.
They were all
yes,
from the
from
institution.
The school.
I wonder if you considered, or if you would consider in the future, looking at how being an external examiner might influence certain things, because I'm wondering, say, if examiners from the institution feel more responsibility towards the students, and maybe if coming as an external examiner, there are other factors such as like competition between institutions and things like that.
The interviewees also reflected their role as external examinators on different schools. So
I see.
For the master's degree, we do have an external examiner, and some of the music teachers also mentioned their perspective on.
Okay, and did it ever come up as a theme, the difference between being an internal?
Yes, it was about taking the development of the student into consideration or not, or just the snapshot. The snapshot perspective of the exam versus taking the development into consideration, the background.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
Montreal, you still have a chance to ask a question if you like. No question? Okay. So maybe first.
Thank you. Well, thank you for your talk. So I understood you talked with teachers and got all sorts of criteria that you in fact make categorized. So my question is, my impression is that they use all these criteria, but now question is whether they is there any situation that they in fact objectively, in a sense subjectively, but they give marks for each criteria, because this what you gathered is in fact a kind of conglomerate from all things that they involve. So, but where is perhaps objectivity of that? So that's my question. Whether is there any idea to give a kind of scale for each of these criteria?
There wasn't in the interviews, no.
No.
There was a mention that when the members of the jury, when they are far apart with the grades, that the discussion kind of becomes more detailed and more criteria are mentioned, kind of drawn out to justify the mark.
Yes.
Yeah. But not in a way that, like one of the quote was, I cannot say that this counts 10% and this counts 20%. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but what do you think that would in fact rise objectivity? Or
no, I don't. As far as when I think of our teachers, I don't think so. No, they wouldn't let us.
They like, in fact, to negotiate. Well, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Was there another question? No.
Hi, thank you. I just so you mentioned diversity, and that they said they have to be balanced, but balanced in what? What is the diversity?
In their opinion or in their grading?
Okay, so general, what they thought of the.
Okay. So there was mentioned that it's kind of a natural process that if it's too much in favor of the student, that you can be certain that one will say, but wait a minute, we need to take this into consideration, or this was not strong enough. So there's like a confidence that the jury will, the opinions will be balanced out, and that they will take the time necessary to discuss to get to an agreement.
Okay, thank you.
We still have time for one last question. And there, yes, okay.
And then maybe not a question, but a commentary on some of the questions and commentaries that we have heard there. And I find it indeed very important what you said, and also you said that students should have an idea, should be clear what do teachers expect from them, on what criteria will they be evaluated at some point, on what are the learning goals and the expectations. And no, we do not have in Lucerne right now a template or a set of criteria scales that are either used by teachers or given as a reference to students. But exactly for this reason, I think in many schools there are not such clear sets of criteria that are stated out. I think exactly for this reason, this was one of our major motivators to run this study, to start looking at. Okay, let's start searching for teachers' view and perspective on that, and maybe from this agglomerate of ideas and topics and reflections, we can come out with some clear guidelines. So, yeah, and just commentary on that.
Okay, this ends this nice round table, and let's thank the presenter again.
Thank you.
So this is the end of the session. Goodbye, Graz. Goodbye, Montreal.
Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.